In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the mighty German Sixth Army met its end, not in a blaze of glory but in starvation, surrender, and unimaginable suffering. More than 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in early 1943, marching into captivity under the brutal hands of their Soviet captors. But for most, surrender was not the end of their nightmare. It was only the beginning. What awaited them was a world of forced marches, starvation, disease, and backbreaking labor in the vast prison camps of the Soviet Union. Few would survive. Fewer still would ever return home. The men who once fought for Hitler's vision of conquest would instead become pawns in a different war, one of propaganda, punishment, and erasure. How did these men endure years, sometimes decades, of captivity? And what brutalities did they face at the hands of the Soviet soldiers? Encirclement at Stalingrad, the fateful beginning of Germany's ultimate downfall. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union unleashed Operation Uranus, a meticulously planned counter-offensive designed to encircle and annihilate the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The Red Army, under the command of Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, struck the flanks of the German forces, targeting the vulnerable Romanian and Italian divisions that guarded the outer perimeter. Poorly equipped and unprepared for the Soviet onslaught, these Axis units crumbled under the weight of thousands of Soviet tanks and infantry. Within days, Soviet forces advanced rapidly, converging at the city of Kalach on November 23rd, effectively sealing the Kessel, the German cauldron. Inside the encirclement, over 250,000 German and Axis troops found themselves trapped. The once proud Sixth Army, the spearhead of Hitler's drive into the Soviet Union, was now at the mercy of the Red Army and the unforgiving Russian winter. Supplies dwindled rapidly as food, fuel, and ammunition ran out. Soldiers scavenged for anything edible, resorting to eating horses, tree bark, and even rats to survive. Cold so bitter that frostbite was a silent killer. The starving ranks themselves began to fester with wounds, and disease spread unchecked. In such a dead situation, Adolf Hitler did not want to allow surrender. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he ordered his General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, to hold out to the last. To bolster his beleaguered troops, Hitler told his troops that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would come airlift his people. This promise, however, was based on fantasy. The Luftwaffe, far from its delivery goals and the scale of the nightmare that was to become Stalingrad, succeeded merely in delivering a small proportion of the 800 tons of supplies required daily. Moldy bread, frozen potatoes, and only if one was lucky, a handful of horse meat were the scraps the starving soldiers were given. Weeks passed and desperation turned into despair. It was letters sent home full of such haunting words as the horrors of encirclement. Hopelessness overcame many soldiers as they knew relief would not come. Others committed suicide rather than slow starvation. Some froze in the snow, too swollen and exhausted to rise again. The Sixth Army told the tale of a once mighty army breaking out of cold, hunger, and disease rather than the battle. By late January 1943, the Red Army had taken a stranglehold on the Kessel and has thrown itself against the remaining German defenders in constant murderous assaults to crush it. Hitler promoted Field Marshal Paulus to an explicit order to fight to the death, but left him to an agonizing choice. He defied Hitler's orders and surrendered on January 31, 1943, when his headquarters were surrounded, and his men either dead or dying. The last German remnants in Stalingrad crumbled 2 days later. Of the 91,000 German soldiers captured, less than 5,000 would get to see their homeland again. Stalingrad had not simply a military disaster, but a turning point in World War II. This had been another myth that had been shattered of Nazi invincibility to suggest that the long road to Berlin had started. However, the war had not ended for those who wished for peace and surrendered. The surrender at Stalingrad, from German soldiers to defeated prisoners of war. The once mighty German Sixth Army had been torn to pieces, starved and among the ruins of Stalingrad by the end of January 1943. They had been through bitter cold and attacks of the Soviet. They had gotten slow death of starvation for months. Their commander, General Friedrich Paulus, had obeyed Hitler's orders to hold the city at all costs until there was no way to hold it. And now they were boxed and had no hope left. but they were trapped between the choice to surrender and disobey the Führer, or fighting to the last breath. On January 31, 1943, Soviet forces stormed the headquarters of the Sixth Army that was in the basement of the Univermag department store in Stalingrad. In the presence of Soviet officers, including Paulus, who had previously commanded 250,000 soldiers, sat Paulus motionless. Just hours before, Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal, another message that he was under orders to die. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus, however, was exhausted and disillusioned and made his decision. When he had no more ammunition, no more supplies, and no reinforcements to come, he capitulated to the Soviets along with his staff. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, following suit, were laying down their weapons and appearing from cellars, blasted buildings, and burrowed trenches across the city. Hollow-eyed, frost-bitten, filthy, tattered uniforms wrapped around many of them whom they were barely recognizable. They put their hands up, shook with cold and hunger. In February too, the last sum of German resistance disappeared. The Battle of Stalingrad got over. Now there were more than 91,000 German soldiers and thousands of Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops prisoners of war. What happened in the life of these men was not the same. There were some who were treated humanely, fed, watered, and looked after by Soviet soldiers who viewed them as ordinary human beings battered by war. Others were not so fortunate. The need for vengeance burnt so hot in many in the Red Army, and they had seen their own cities destroyed, their families killed, and comrades frozen to death in the snow. The Germans were in no way due any mercy for them, such as prisoners being shot and bayoneted or being executed on the spot. Survivors were reported to speak of. Some had their boots and coats stripped from them, and they were left to freeze in the cold. The ordeal for those that survived the initial surrender had not ended. Months of starvation had weakened their bodies as columns of prisoners marching through deep snow out of the ruins of Stalingrad. War hardened Soviet guards, who were prone to little patience for those they could not catch up. They were shot down where they lay or left to die. Another battle came in the road to captivity, against hunger, exhaustion, and bitter Russian winter. For the first time, an entire German field army had been destroyed. Hitler's catastrophe was a turning point in World War II. For the men that had survived the battle, however, it would only be the beginning of their suffering. About 91,000 prisoners were taken, of whom fewer than 5,000 would ever be seen in Germany again. For all, surrender was not the end of war, but the start of another nightmare. The death marches of Stalingrad, a long and cruel road to captivity. The end of the fight for Stalingrad was over, but for the 91,000 German soldiers that surrendered, the real challenge wasn't over yet. With war having devastated the Soviet Union and its ability to provide for its own people, there was not just an absence of resources, but also little room for accommodating so many prisoners. Lacking trains or vehicles, there was really only one option: to march hundreds of miles across the frozen steppe in blizzards, starvation, and exhaustion. Almost immediately after the February 2nd, 1943 surrender, the forced marches started. Yet, the captives were hardened too, and Soviet guards themselves had been hardened by war and showed little sympathy. For them, these men were such invaders. They had invaded their homeland and had wrought destruction upon it. Also, there was no organized system of care of the German soldiers. Instead, they were placed in long columns, miles long in some spots, and marched toward hastily erected transit camps. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures were often below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit in the Russian winter. Their greatcoats and boots were no longer lost in battle or stolen along with other riches by vengeful Soviet troops, and most of the prisoners wore nothing more than their tattered summer uniforms. They wrapped themselves with many rags around their feet so that they would not get frostbite, but it was pointless. The ice-covered roads had each step causing shocks of pain to go through their starving bodies. Soon hunger and thirst became unbearable. Little food was provided by the Soviet guards. They tossed a handful of frozen bread into the snow for the men to scramble over. They who could not fight for food were left with nothing, and water was no easier to find. Prisoners had to eat snow to keep hydrated, making matters worse for their bedraggled condition. As he stepped closer to passing mile, the weakest among them started falling. The dying had no time for stopping. The guards shot those who collapsed, either to leave them behind or to slow the march, and those who collapsed were left behind. There were corpses along the road to captivity, men who had felled here and frozen where they dropped, their bodies soon covered by drifting snow. Records later showed survivors that, from paratroop drops, prisoners were abandoned in the snow and had been frozen solid like statues, their empty eyes gazing in the void. The survivors huddled by their warmth together to share their body heat at night. There were times that prisoners would lay down and simply never wake up. Their bodies were weakened by dysentery, typhus and pneumonia, and disease spread quickly. It was a day for every mile they marched. More men vanished to the Russian winter. After weeks of living through these torments, those who survived got to the transit camps, but their journey was by no means over. Now, those who had survived marches found themselves subjected to new horrors of famine, disease, and the near insupportable weight of captivity. But of the 91,000 prisoners taken at Stalingrad, almost two-thirds perished between the surrender and reaching a permanent camp. The hell of Soviet prison camps, starvation, suffering, and survival against all odds. The result of those brutal marches from Stalingrad was that the German soldiers who survived reached their next ordeal, the Soviet prisoner of war camps. Beketovka, Frolovo, and Oranki were scattered across the vast Soviet interior, which along with others had become the final resting place for tens of thousands. They had already suffered for months on starvation and exposure and knew full well that they were far from over. They died in these camps from disease, from exhaustion, from despair, not from bullets or bombs. Beketovka near Stalingrad was one of the most infamous transit camps. Meant only as a holding area, until someone arrived to take him home, it soon became a place of mass death from lack of medical care and overcrowding. Many of the prisoners were too weak to stand, and they were packed into freezing barracks and starved. The sick could now die in agony because there was nothing that could be done. They succumbed to dysentery and typhus that spread rapidly. They described their nightmare of stepping over corpses just to find space to lie down. Each morning, Soviet guards would haul the corpses of those who had died during the night from the barracks out at legs like firewood. At Frolovo also, another transit camp, thousands of German soldiers, high-ranking officers, were starved. Indeed, the Soviet Union was itself in a state of food shortages, and feeding such prisoners was not a high priority. Even if food was made available, the daily ration was a watery soup of rotting cabbage with a small piece of dry bread. Sawdust, grass, leather scraps, or even the leather scraps that the prisoners themselves made were resorted to by many prisoners to fill their stomachs. Weak enough to get no food, those fell away in dull torment of starvation, living in their flesh. The former Orthodox monastery Oranki was transformed into a camp where the German prisoners were worn out physically and mentally in a campaign of physical and psychological warfare. The first moves by the Soviets to initiate systematic reorientation of the prisoners politically have been efforts to break the prisoners' loyalty to Hitler and make them into anti-fascist propagandists. The prisoners were selected, particularly officers and educated men were isolated, followed by endless indoctrination sessions. The best treatment was dished out to those who cooperated by Soviet officers who preached the failures of the Nazi regime and the power of communism. Desperate for survival, some prisoners, realizing the terrible truth, even became willing participants, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization created to spread Soviet-aligned propaganda among German troops. But others wouldn't give in, refusing to turn countrymen for the harsh conditions. The reactionaries, however, were not only blamed for being exploited by the rich, but these men were also called reactionaries and were subjected to far more severe treatments. So some were sent into the punishment camps in Siberia, where survival was almost impossible. Despair hung heavily in the air across all of these camps. It wasn't long later that we passed skeletal figures dressed in rags, eyes sunken and hollow faces, that used to be part of the unstoppable Wehrmacht. It was a relief to many to dream of rescue, a return home to their families, but for most freedom was still years, if not decades, off. Out of total 91,000 soldiers captured at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 would at one point or another see Germany. The suffering of the ones who perished ended in the frozen wastelands of captivity. The memories of Soviet prison camps would torment those who had lived to tell the tale for the rest of their lives. the winter of death, struggling for survival in the frozen Soviet prison camps. The winter of 1943–44 was one of the darkest chapters in the story of the German prisoners of war taken at Stalingrad. The conditions in Soviet captivity were already grim, but as the temperatures plunged and disease ran rampant, survival became almost impossible. Many of the makeshift transit camps were little more than death pits, where men succumbed not to bullets, but to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Some camps saw death rates exceeding 70%, turning them into graveyards of the once mighty Sixth Army. The exact number of German prisoners who perished in Soviet captivity remains disputed. Soviet records indicate that approximately 45,000 prisoners from Stalingrad died in the months following their surrender. However, German estimates suggest a far grimmer reality. Many survivors later testified that the real number was closer to 60,000 or even 75,000. The truth may never be fully known, as countless prisoners were buried in unmarked mass graves, their names lost to history. What remains undisputed is that less than 5,000 of the original 91,000 POWs would ever return home. For those who clung to life, each day was a brutal test of endurance. Food was scarce, and the daily ration, if provided at all, was barely enough to sustain a man. A typical meal consisted of thin, watery cabbage soup, a piece of stale bread, or boiled potato peels. Desperate prisoners turned to eating rats, insects, and even scraps of garbage just to survive. Some risked severe punishment by stealing food from Soviet supply stores, but those caught were beaten or executed on the spot. The freezing Russian winter was an enemy just as deadly as starvation. The prisoners, already weakened from months of suffering, had little to no proper clothing. Many had lost their boots and resorted to wrapping their feet in rags to ward off frostbite. It was common for men to wake up beside frozen corpses, their bodies stiff and covered in frost. Medicine was non-existent, resulting in prisoners who died as their bodies were carried outside to the growing stakes of cadavers. Being alive necessitated workers to face brutal conditions of mandatory labor duties. During Soviet wartime operations, the military organization needed additional workforce, even though prisoners at that point received meager rations. The surviving prisoners, who demonstrated their weakened state, performed physical labor at quarries and mines and factories under sub-zero temperatures for 12 to 14 consecutive hours. Times passed when prisoners died of fatigue because the Soviet system possessed unlimited prisoners to continue exploiting. Prisoners still managed to stay alive even when subjected to absolute inhumane circumstances. Among these groups, prisoners distributed their limited food shares along with mutual protection services. The prisoners who managed to stay sane employed their mental resources through prayer repetition or recitation of stories as a method to avoid insanity. Tens of thousands of prisoners succumbed to death before the worst period of winter had fully emerged. The living prisoners faced no cause for joy because they had simply endured another day in the Soviet prison camp's tragic existence. The Stalingrad Germans in Soviet propaganda, captives turned into political tools. Stalingrad was not just a military catastrophe for Nazi Germany, but also a military and propaganda victory for Soviet Union. Stalin's regime had symbolically won the sight of tens of thousands of defeated Wehrmacht soldiers, their once proud ranks reduced to starving, frost-bitten prisoners. Once the idea of treating these captives reached Soviet authorities, they saw the possibilities. These captives could be used as labor and also for psychological warfare with the Third Reich. Interrogators in the Soviet system began working even from the moment the prisoners were taken to identify those who were useful. Special treatment was therefore granted to officers, intellectuals, and politically disillusioned soldiers. Some were promised better food, lighter labor, and better living, only if they cooperated. High-ranking officers faced intense, often threatening psychological isolation and prodigious manipulation as well. The National Committee for a Free Germany, NKFD, one of the Soviets' most effective weapons, was one of those options. This Soviet-backed organization was born in July 1943, aiming to break Nazi rule by propelling German soldiers to fall upon Hitler. The NKFD had portrayed itself as the patriotic nucleus of German nationalists, prepared to save their country from destruction, not as Soviet puppets. Germany's true enemies were not the Soviets, but Hitler and his inner circle, who drew the nation into a suicidal war. Their message was carefully crafted. It was crucial that captured officers played a role in spreading this message. Among the most visible ex-Wehrmacht officers was former Wehrmacht Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a Stalingrad prisoner who was among the most prominent participating in the 1980 Olympiad. Unlike most of his colleagues, Seydlitz was not loyal to Hitler. Rather than this, he became one of the most outspoken in the NKFD campaigning German soldiers to surrender to the Red Army rather than fight a hopeless war. He even suggested setting up an armed Free Germany Legion, which he never managed to do. A similar path was taken by other high-profile captives. Initially, the commander of the Sixth Army, Friedrich Paulus, refused to cooperate. A believer in military duty, he spent months in captivity, refusing to take up the overtures of the Soviet. His stance softened, but as the war turned decisively against Germany and reports of Nazi atrocities began to appear, his support for the leader waned. He publicly condemned Hitler and supported NKFD in 1944. There were few things more severe for the morale of the German soldier than the speech of the hero of Stalingrad addressed to the radio of Radio Moscow, when even the hero of Stalingrad turned against Hitler. So what hope could there still be? However, not all German prisoners accepted Soviet propaganda efforts. In fact, General Karl Strecker and many officers actively resisted cooperation to the last. Refusing to work for the NKFD, Strecker spent years being tortured in prison for his refusal in an attempt not to break his oath with the Reich. And thousands of ordinary soldiers resisted, took suffering over submission, even amidst conditions of captivity that were all but hopeless. The propaganda value of the Germans' prisoners used by the Soviets was extremely effective in weakening morale on the Eastern Front and planting seeds in the mind of the Wehrmacht. By the time the war was over, many former NKFD members became seen as traitors during post-war Germany or disappear in anonymity. For those who had collaborated, it was a decision of survival, conviction, or plain and simple pragmatism. Most would have no choice but to become Stalingrad prisoners, caught up in the machinery of war. But for most of those prisoners, there was no choice but grimmer reality of captivity. Years in captivity, a relentless struggle between hope, despair, and survival. The May 1945 ending of the war for them did not bring immediate freedom. Other countries let prisoner of war go soon after the war ended, whereas the Soviet Union kept on holding tens of thousands of German captives for years and even decades. A few were forced in to rebuild the Soviet Union after it was made war-torn by Stalin's paranoia and suspicions, while some were arrested and were terms of prisoner. Living in captivity for these men was a test of wills that too many would not win. After the war's end, the Soviet Union still had hundreds of thousands of German POWs, including those captured in Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. There was a difference between German prisoners in British or American camps who were repatriated slowly and most of the German prisoners in the USSR, about whom little is known. But disaster for the Soviet homeland had been the destruction of its cities, factories, and infrastructure, and therefore labor was desperately needed to help rebuild. Toiling under brutal conditions in the mines, quarries, and on the building sites, German prisoners became an essential part of this effort. The issue of German POWs was more than just labor to Stalin. Deep in his paranoia, Drum saw that the prisoners he held, not just the Germans but even Soviet captives taken prisoner by the enemy Germans, were potentially traitors. It was, he feared, possible that releasing large numbers of German prisoners too quickly would destabilize Soviet control over Eastern Europe or offer the West sympathizers. The consequence was that thousands of German soldiers remained in the custody of the Soviets for years after the war, and being trapped was the least of their worries. The first large-scale releases didn't occur until 5 years later, during 1950. At this time, thousands had already perished to exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Many officers and high-profile prisoners were retained behind, however, as they were considered useful bargaining chips in Cold War diplomacy. They were subjected to Soviet indoctrination programs, similar to wartime efforts of the National Committee for a Free Germany, for example, in the hope of turning them into assets of Communist East Germany. It was only with the 1953 death of Joseph Stalin that the remaining prisoners had their fate change. Under his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, there was an attempt to put Stalin's oppression behind him and undertaken a mass repatriation program. In 1955, the last in the largest group of German POWs, about 10,000 men, left for Germany after negotiations with West Germany. Most of them were high-ranking officers of the Stalingrad campaign, among them a few who were prisoners over a decade. The world, however, had changed beyond recognition for them who came back. Some of them had lost their families, their homes, or their wives remarrying. Former prisoners were met with indifference or suspicion in East and West Germany. Some had been branded traitors for coming up alive from Soviet captivity, while others battled to reinsert themselves into a society that had discussed them without them. Their fate was lost for decades for those who never made it back. Well into the 21st century, mass graves in the former Soviet Union continued to be found. But the thousands of people that died in the long years of captivity were also a grim reminder. The survivors of Stalingrad's battle, the death marches, and the frozen hell of Soviet prison camps had survived so much to be confronted with the fact that, for much of them, the war had yet to end. The return from captivity, coming home to a changed and divided Germany. It was a long and uncertain journey home for the German soldiers captured at Stalingrad and afterwards. The war ended in 1945, but many of the Soviet prisoners were held in captivity for years to come, depending on Stalin's policies, the Cold War tense, and so on. Repatriations didn't begin until 1948, then a final wave in 1955, and many of the returning soldiers were forced into a Germany that, however unfamiliar, they did not recognize. There were the first large-scale repatriations in 1948, the first Cold War, as the Soviet Union was consolidating its power in East Germany, GDR, German Democratic Republic. With the first prisoners among them were those judged politically useful, those who had joined Soviet-backed groups such as the National Committee for a Free Germany. The Soviet authorities reconstructed these men as educated anti-fascists in order to pass judgment on the men and build a socialist East Germany. Most of the former prisoners, no matter what beliefs they had no option than to play those roles out if they wanted to get out of being captive. Hope, however, remained for those still in Soviet hands. When West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited Moscow in 1955 to broker the release of the final captive, Soviet forces withdrew their last prisoners. Adenauer's diplomatic efforts saw the return of some 10,000 German POWs who had been in captivity for over 10 years. Now they were miserably thin men, lost in their trance and exhausted from the years of forced labor, malnutrition, disease, and mental abuse. A few had given up hope long before of ever seeing their homeland again. After returning, they found that Germany had been just as changed as they had. Returning prisoners were met with mixed reception in West Germany. There were public ceremonies to welcome them home, but the reality was not so cold. After the war, many former soldiers could not settle in a society that had gone forth without them. Many wives had remarried, many children had grown into adulthood without fathers, and the post-war German economy no longer had room for the men who had fought and lived under the Hitler's empire. Worst of all was coming bad. Some thought the arriving POWs might have gone communist as a result of their lengthy Soviet captivity. But equally, it was different, even the situation in East Germany. Only POWs who came back conforming to the communist ideology were embraced by the Socialist Unity Party, SED. Many in their positions of influence in government and military were those who had worked with Soviet propaganda. Other sectors of the population, such as those who had resisted Soviet indoctrination, were marginalized or under state surveillance. Former prisoners, in turn, could not or would not stand the new political order and tried to flee to the West, risking imprisonment or even death at the hands of the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. Many returning prisoners had deep psychological scars, and this was beyond the political landscape. They were physically broken, years of malnutrition, forced labor and exposure to extreme conditions. The emotional trauma was even worse, what would come to be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In post-war Germany, there was no understanding or sympathy for these men. The war was won, the country was on its way to recovery. So many former POWs opted not to speak because there was no place there for stories of suffering and captivity. Not everyone who had spent time in Soviet captivity went home rejoicing. The Germany they had fought for no longer existed, insolvent and broken, and the country they returned to had little patience for the ghosts of the past. The real fight did not end for a lot of people until they'd come home. The endless labor, German POWs as forced workers in the Soviet state. Captivity did not mean rest or relief for the German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad. Instead, it was an indication of the years of grisly forced labor to come under the Soviet regime. Nearly 2,000 prisoners were shuttled around Soviet gulags and shipped on overcrowded cattle cars to Siberia, the Ural Mountains, and devastated cities in Ukraine and Russia. It wasn't to spend the war in confinement, only to become slaves of the Soviet state, to help rebuild the very nation they once had fought to destroy. On arrival at these labor camps, the prisoners were sorted quickly and then assigned to work on the basis of their physical condition. They were sent to coal mines, quarries, logging camps, and endured exhausting shifts in freezing temperatures. At factories, railroads, and construction sites, others were assigned to helping to rebuild bombed-out Soviet cities. At the prime site of forced labor, German prisoners had forced to clear the rubble and reconstruct the city they had helped reduce to ruins. The camps were brutal beyond papers. Prisoners were put to work for 12 to 16 hours without much in terms of primitive tools and functioning bare hands doing the job. Most of the Soviet overseers were harsh. Many had lost family members to the German invasion. Punishment for those who worked too slowly or were signs of exhaustion was to beat, deny food, or put outside and freeze. The work was constant, and there was not an escape until you could suffer more. In the end, malnutrition was one of the greatest killers in these camps. Every day, a heap of watery cabbage soup, a few ounces of black bread, and sometimes fish or a pinch of meat is what the prisoners were fed on daily. Total calories consumed in the mines and quarries were thousands per day, but only a fraction of the sustenance was provided to keep their body going. They were constantly gnawed by hunger and had to scavenge food, eating rats, grass, and sometimes even scraps from Soviet guards' trash bins. Medical care was virtually non-existent. They went untreated, the infection spread, and diseases scarred the prisoners like tuberculosis, pneumonia, and dysentery. Survival became even harder in Soviet winters due to the extreme cold. The many German soldiers were already weakened by starvation and froze to death overnight in their barracks. Those who were able to survive the brutal winters were also destined to be killed by deadly summers, where the heat, insects, and exhaustion made it so simple to become dehydrated and heat stroke. This unrelenting hardship could not prevent Soviet authorities from asking more out of the prisoners. The aim was to extract as much labor as one could before the men withered. Too weak to resist, some let themselves lay down and wait to die, all knowing their struggle was useless. Some others tried to do the impossible, convinced of the willpower they possessed and hope of one-day release. In very Soviet labor machine, people's lives had no significance. For many German prisoners, this forced labor seemed a death sentence without any execution. They were more than just soldiers now, more like beasts or broken, weighed down by a war that had ended long since. When finally home, scars from captivity, physical and psychological, would stay with these people for the rest of their days. The disease epidemic, death and suffering in the overcrowded prison camp barracks. By that time, the Red Army was, perversely, an enemy as merciless as disease, which killed German prisoners of war in the Vastaya Soviet labor camp network. For the survivors of the brutal marches into captivity and the back-breaking labor, illness was an unthinkable killer. Crowded and without any good sanitation prison camps spread disease and become breeding grounds for diseases that were deadly. Battling typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, men who had been on the front line waging war now had little hope of survival. There was no humanity in the conditions of the barracks. They were dragged to dark, unheated wooden huts where thousands of prisoners could sleep shoulder to shoulder on rotting planks. Typhus was a disease that would cause high fever, weakness, and eventually organ failure, spread by lice infestations that were rampant. Contaminated water and spoiled food were responsible for causing dysentery, which left prisoners too weak to stand and continually dehydrated. The Siberian winter, with temperatures low enough to cause prisonmen to begin to pneumonia from lack of exposure, and an immune system that had not been exposed to infection in months of starvation. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. The few doctors among the prisoners did what they could, but with no antibiotics, no bandages, and no proper facilities, their efforts were hopeless. Surgical procedures were carried out without anesthesia, and wounds, if not treated immediately, often turned gangrenous. Tuberculosis spread uncontrollably, coughing prisoners infecting those around them, their frail bodies wasting away in slow agony. The Soviet guards showed little mercy. Many saw the German prisoners not as human beings, but as symbols of the devastation the Nazis had inflicted on their homeland. Requests for medicine were often ignored, and those who fell ill were left to die in their bunks, too weak to move, their suffering a lingering punishment for the war they had waged. Those who became too sick to work were seen as burdens, sometimes denied food altogether or simply dragged outside and left in the snow to perish. As the death toll rose, the camps became giant charnel houses. With no proper burial procedures, prisoners were often tossed into mass graves, their bodies stacked upon one another in frozen earth. In some cases, the dead were left unburied for days, their corpses piled outside the barracks until the ground had thawed enough for digging. For many, there would be no headstone, no marker, only an unmarked pit where thousands of lives ended in silence. Psychological torture, the brutal methods used to break the spirits of men. The physical pains suffered by the starvation, forced labor, and disease inflicted on the German soldiers captured at Stalingrad were only part of their torment. It was just as, if not more, miserable psychologically. In fact, many soldiers, formerly Wehrmacht soldiers, who were now under a forced system making them part of the machine, were being broken. Not just their bodies, but their minds and spirit as well. Isolation, interrogation, and deliberate, slow but relentless propaganda incured thousands of minds. Hopelessness infected like a disease in the barracks. What lots of prisoners feared more than anything was the uncertainty of their fate. Whereas most POWs in the West were eventually repatriated, POWs in Soviet camps never knew if they would ever see home again. They had no letters, no news of families, and no appreciation for time such as the flow of bitter seasons. Some were Nazi loyalists, some were mere foot soldiers, all were PC in a state that viewed them as the enemies to be punished. Soviet authorities cut off individuals for weeks and even months, often to freezing, windowless cells in which the prisoners had no mind other than their own. Soon many had lost their grip on reality and had been deprived of social interaction. A few would talk to themselves, recurrently conversing with the imagined family members or long-dead comrades. Some just withdrew to the utmost silence, unspaking except when they were commanded. Interrogations were just as relentless. The main aim of Soviet officers was to obtain confessions, real or invented, from their prisoners. Accused of war crimes they never committed, some prisoners were tortured into confessing and renouncing their past, renouncing to have sworn with the allegiance of the Soviet cause. As they resisted, they were made to sleep deprived, tortured for dangerous levels of time, and psychologically manipulated. They were falsely promised release in return for cooperation, told to lead a productive and praiseworthy life, and then sent back to the camps when they became expendable. Soviet propaganda was one of the most effective of psychological tortures. Re-education was also used against high-ranking officers and politically influential prisoners who were forced to sit through endless lectures on the communist ideology. Some were forced to hand over their names to the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet coalition created to solicit former Nazi officers to align against Hitler's regime. Some were ready for better treatment or too tired to resist and agreed to work with. Others refused, enduring further punishment. Many prisoners saw death as the only escape. Suicides in the camps were frightfully common. There were some men who hanged themselves by scraping up some rope or taking a rope from their own belts in the barracks. Some took up walking to the freezing cold night and lay there in the snow and gave up to the cold. Some even incited guards into shooting them instead of dying slowly in captivity. Execution squads were not needed to destroy a prisoner in the Soviet system. Endless uncertainty, forced confessions, and mental deterioration was more than enough to break even the strongest men. When some prisoners were finally released years, even decades later, the men were no longer the same soldiers who had once marched off to battle. Haunted by years of captivity and the memory of the ones who did not survive, they were shadows of their former self. The forgotten men, German soldiers who never returned from Soviet captivity. Captivity in Soviet Union became a death sentence for thousands of German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad. Many died miserably in the brutal camps of forced labor, but others simply vanished, leaving their fates disappeared in history. Still decades later, their families had no answers, had lost their names in Soviet archives, had no marked grave, and were forgotten. It was staggering on the scale of the disappearance. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who fell into Russian captivity at Stalingrad, less than 6,000 would be allowed to return to their homeland. Others were executed soon after surrender, their bodies dumped in mass graves or starved to death or simply died of exhaustion and disease. However, for thousands, it is not known whether they will live or die. Others are thought to have died in remote camps and their names to have never been recorded, their remnants buried in the frozen earth of Siberia or the rubble of war-torn cities. Some had been transferred far into the Soviet Union, their identities wiped clean by being forced to labor in mines, forests, and work sites to die anonymous. The missing were all but abandoned back in Germany. With its shattered economy to rebuild and integration with the Western world to achieve, West Germany had little desire to demand the return of every last one. In 1955, when Chancellor Konrad Adenauer managed to get thousands released, the number of unaccounted for was in the thousands, with their existence reduced to unanswered letters and forgotten memories. The war never stopped for their families. It only dragged on and on into suffering of uncertainty. Instead, they were treated differently in East Germany when returning prisoners. Only those who had been educated in Soviet captivity were welcomed to the communist regime in control under Soviet control. Many returnees were political tools in the sense that they were paraded as examples of how the new Germany should accept socialism and reject its Nazi past. Torture was considered the proper way to treat those who refused to comply with Soviet ideology, were considered traitors, questionable and marginalized. Instead, they became either inconvenient remnants of a lost war or heroes. Some German soldiers were captured and became the final chapters of captivity until the mid-1950s. Most POWs were repatriated by 1948, however, thousands remained in Soviet camps another decade. Sometimes they had the evidence, sometimes not, but any one of these men were often accused men of war crimes. Officially charged, many were never, and in many cases their presence was never officially acknowledged by their homeland or the Soviets. Then some of the former soldiers only came back in the 50s, and their bodies were old, much older than they were, and their minds had been shattered by the horrors they had endured. It left families of those who never came home with silence. Unanswered, those letters went nowhere. Red Cross inquiries provided no answers, and even the Soviet Union would not discuss how many had died in its labor camps. Mass graves would be found decades later all over Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan as the skeletal remains of German soldiers were revealed who never had their deaths officially declared. Stalingrad was not only a place of war but a place of history, the victims of both. Their loss was masked by political agendas, covered in years of Cold War sentiment and shifting national callings. Their full story is yet to be told, so some of their names are simply whispered by the wind over the unmarked graves of the East. It is perhaps the ghastliest tragedy of the Second World War, in that the fate of the German soldiers captured at Stalingrad has never been clear. Less than 6,000 of the 91,000 who surrendered would be seen again in Germany. The rest died in the brutal marches, the disease-ridden barracks, or endless labor camps of the Soviet Union. Our bodies were stuffed into mass graves, and their names are written in unmarked pits, and their suffering left in the layers of political secrecy. The scar of captivity never faded for those who had returned. The weight of the loss of their friends, the years they had stolen from them, and the painful memories of a war that never stopped was borne by them. However, their story is more than just a story of suffering by numerous human beings due to the war, because it is a tale of human cost of war. It makes us face the brutal repercussion of war and those on the other side of the grave. Otherwise, we risk repeating their fate if we forget it.